Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Good. Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review for November 4th, 2001. This is Chris Driscoll. Along with me is Rainer Shea. How are you doing, Rainer?
Oh, I've had a fun night, having a night ride with one of my buddies.
A night ride.
And yeah, and you have included an article that I'm eager to talk about.
One of your articles.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let us know which one that is when we get to it. Meantime, let's start off with the first topic, which is existing socialism success discredits Friedman's core argument. I don't know who this Friedman is you're referring. Is that the New York Times Friedman?
Milton Friedman.
Oh, Milton. Okay, no, that's not the New York Times Friedman. That's Chicago school, Chicago boys, the inventor of neoliberalism. Which is really, he's not an inventor of it, because neoliberalism is just liberalism and it's been around for 300 years at least. But they call it neoliberalism these days because they're being extra added bastardly these days, extra added brutal, but it's still liberalism. Anyway, so tell us about it.
This is the essay that I wrote for my college class. I've been able to also publish it online. It addresses Friedman's argument that, well, how can you say that the chains of the workers in the Soviet Union are any lighter than the chains of the workers in the US, Britain, or any other Western country? This is a quote from his book, Capitalism and Freedom. And I talk about how dishonest this argument is, because it comes from this stance that just because there was a strong state within the Soviet Union, and this can be applied today, just because there's a strong state within China, Cuba, these other socialist countries, that supposedly means that the workers in those countries are just as oppressed as the ones here. And it's telling how Friedman implicitly admits that the workers in the capitalist countries are oppressed. It's clear that his ideology views that as acceptable. Anyway, within these countries, there are important freedoms that the workers have, that the workers in places like the United States simply do not have. I researched how in the Soviet Union, there was the lowest tariff on rents in the world at that time. It was a rule where no workers would have to pay rents that were that surpassed 4% of their income. And apparently in the Soviet Union, on any given year, millions of people either moved or improved their living conditions, and housing was free for everyone on the waiting list. Imagine what that would do for the working class in the United States, especially right now, as millions of people are at risk of eviction due to the really flimsy, unreliable tenant protection laws. And you could go on and on about the protections that the working class have in socialist countries that the workers here simply do not have. And I think it comes down to the fact that Marx and Friedman have different ideas of what freedom is. Like they prioritize different types of freedom. In the Soviet Union, it may have been against the law for anyone to become a millionaire, but it was also against the law for landlords to mistreat tenants. And that gave tenants the freedoms that would be unimaginable that for workers here. It's pretty depressing how when you think about it, it's hard for us to imagine within our environment a scenario where healthcare is free, where housing is free, where the rent by law is so low, and so on.
Yeah, that's all very true. It strikes me. Here's the thing. Security in the Soviet Union, the security state, which is what the Americans call authoritarianism or totalitarianism or whatnot. It was for the purpose of defending the revolution, of defending the state against all the onslaught, the attacks of imperialism. And the attacks of imperialism were many, 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 starting with 14 imperialist countries, including the United States, sending troops to smother, to defeat and smother the Soviet revolution in its cradle, and going on to all kinds of the most despicable forms of terrorism, economic sabotage, the list goes on and on. And yes, the Americans and other imperialist countries did recruit Soviet citizens for this purpose. So there were evil people in the Soviet Union who were willing to sell their country out, sell their souls to the American devil. And that's what the security state in the Soviet Union had to deal with for all the years that the Soviet Union existed. So, yeah, Friedman's core argument is a little bit faulty there. People in the Soviet Union, well, we were always told when I was a kid, oh, the Soviet Union's standard of living is so much lower than the United States, and they would, to prove that, they would put up this figure of this is what average Soviet Union worker makes, and what they bring home, and that was less than the average American worker. However, they didn't include all those facts, like that the Soviet Union's workers paid 4% of their income for rent, whereas I personally have paid half of my income for rent my entire life. And I still pay half of my income for rent now when I'm retired. And that's pretty damn common in the United States, that you literally pay half of your income for rent, which doesn't leave you much left. Even if you make more, it's not enough to make up for not having free health care, for not having low-cost food and low-cost low-cost rent, low-cost, all this different stuff that you had, free health care, free elder care, free child care, all of that stuff you didn't need any money for. So, the real standard of living of the Soviet people was much higher than the American people, if you included what the whole package of being in a socialist country. Anyway, why the troubled U.S. empire could quickly fall apart. Now, this comes from an article by Richard D. Wolff, and many of our audience are aware of Richard D. Wolff. He's probably the most well-known Marxist economist in the world today, or at least among the most well-known. He's one of the very few Marxists that I actually see on television in the United States. So, I mean, there are some problems with Richard D. Wolff. He's got the state capitalist garbage where he says that all the existing socialist worker states are state capitalists. But that's a kind of a problem. But he's smart in a lot of ways, and he's not always wrong. He's often right. And in this one, he says why the troubled U.S. empire could quickly fall apart. He says, when empires decline, they can slip into self-reinforcing downward spirals. This downward spiral occurs when the rich and the powerful respond by using their social position to offload the cost of decline onto the mass of the population. And I'm going to just give some highlights here from this article, but basically what he's describing is all of the reasons that the U.S. empire could quickly fall apart. The U.S. wars lost in Iraq and Iran showed imperial overreach beyond what even 20 years of war could manage. That the defeats were drawn out for so many years shows that domestic politics and the founding of the domestic military-industrial complex were more than geopolitics, the key drivers of these wars. Empires can die from overreach and sacrificing broadly, social goals for the narrow interests of political and economic minorities. The United States has 4.25% of the world's population, yet accounts for about 20% of the global deaths from COVID-19. A rich global superpower with a highly developed medical industry proved to be badly prepared for the unable to cope with a viral pandemic. Levels of debt, government, corporate, and household, are all at a or near historic records and rising. Feeding and thereby supporting the rising debt is the Federal Reserve with its years of quantitative easing. Officials at the highest level are now discussing the possible issuance of $1 trillion platinum coin to give the Fed, to have the Fed give that sum in new credit to the U.S. Treasury to enable more U.S. government spending. The purpose goes far beyond political squabbling over the cap on the national debt. Hold on a sec here. Okay. The goal is nothing less than freeing the government to inject still more massive amounts of new money into the capitalist system to sustain it in times of unprecedented difficulty. The Fed learned that today's capitalism needs such quanta of monetary stimulus thanks to the three recent crashes, 2000, 2008, 2020, witnessed by the capitalist system. A desperate empire approaches a version of the modern monetary theory that empire leaders mocked and rejected not very long ago. Extreme inequality, already a distinguishing feature of the United States, worsened during the pandemic. This inequality fuels rising poverty and rising social divisions among the haves and the have-nots, and the increasingly obnoxious think they have, whatever that is, think they have, attempt by employers to recoup the profits lost to the pandemic and to the capitalist crash during 2020 and 2021 have led many to impose additional squeezes on employees. This has led to official and unofficial strikes that continue amid a reawakening labor movement. On an individual level, the rate of workers who have been quitting their jobs has been hitting record highs. And he goes on and on, gives a lot of these kind of examples showing the severe decline in the United States of America and in the American empire. So this is an article that's well worth reading. We'll have a link for you under this video when we put it up. So what are your thoughts, Rainer?
I see realities like this, and I contrast it. I contrast them to the kinds of commentaries that I've read and that I've actually put out that compare the standards of living of workers in the U.S. to the standards of living of workers in the exploited countries. And, you know, in spite of these incredible inequalities within the United States, the wealth gap, even between U.S. proletarians and, say, Haitian proletarians, is still so massive. There's so much, the level of poverty that imperialism has created worldwide is, I feel, incomprehensible even for us, despite despite all the ways that austerity has been hammering our society. And that's, I think, what we need to reckon with, this reality of global inequality, if we're going to liberate ourselves. Because if we come at this task of class struggle with the mindset that we need to create a socialist America, or that we need to just vote in somebody like AOC to create a new deal, then we're going to screw over the oppressed populations worldwide. And by definition, imperialism is not socialism. So we're going to be stuck with just a new version of capitalism. So international solidarity is the only way that we're going to free ourselves from our chains. We need to come at this with a mentality that the workers here are not at odds with the workers in the exploited world, despite this huge wealth gap that imperialism has created between the two. The only way for us to become free is to have humility as Americans, like people who grew up in this imperialistic society, and recognize that all workers need to stand with each other, or we're all going down.
Exactly. Okay. Anti-Asian hate is a symptom of intensifying capitalist reaction.
Or at least increasing Asian hate is a symptom of intensifying capitalist reaction, since anti-Asian hate has existed in the US from the start. The intensification of anti-Asian hate that we've seen in these last couple of years is eerily reminiscent of the explosion in anti-Chinese racism that occurred within Indonesia during the time of the CIA coup there, that installed a military dictatorship which carried out a genocide that killed something like 1 million people. And that's a pretty alarming parallel, I think. There's this ethnic minority that's at the forefront, bearing the greatest brunt of the capitalist reaction, both because the U.S. empire has set its sights upon China and seeks to demonize Chinese people, and because, as history has shown, the endangerment of a scapegoated minority is a pretty common occurrence when capital switches into fascist mode. Fascism is the fighting wing of the bourgeoisie. It seeks to mobilize the petty bourgeois, so-called middle class, into aligning with the capitalists, like the richest people, out of the due to the narrative that there are these so-called social parasites that are sucking out society and endangering the nation, whatever that means. And it's really alarming to see this fascism metastasize in these last couple of years in particular. It's been pretty alarming to see history repeat itself.
Yeah. I've heard so many stories of anti-Asian hate increasing tremendously over the last couple of years. And there's some really horrific stories out there of it. Just because you're a person who is Asian or looks Asian, the hatred is really intense now. And it is definitely, at least in large part, the result of anti-Chinese hate mongering. Like the Chinese virus that Trump used to trump up all the time. Even though we have a lot of reason to believe that the virus came from America, not from China. Yeah, it's really horrendous. Really a horrendous symptom of the growing fascism in America. Next on the list, International Tribunal finds U.S. guilty of crimes against humanity. Now, this is a project of a group of people, many of whom are quite well known in New York City. And they held, the International Tribunal on Human Rights Abuses against Black, Brown, and Indigenous people was held October 23rd and 25th at the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial Educational Center in Washington Heights, New York City, Akot Turtle Island, Lenape Island. The main theme of the tribunal was, we still charge genocide. In recognition of the We Charge Genocide, the crime of the government against the Negro people, a 1951 petition to the United Nations signed by dozens of notables, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Claudia Jones, Harry Haywood, and Paul Robeson. The 2021 indictment is against the United States of America, represented by its president, Department of State, federal and state policing agencies, and other government institutions. The panel of jurists heard testimony emphasizing the millions upon millions of indigenous and African peoples murdered, disappeared, and nearly eliminated over a period from 1492 through the present. Further, the witnesses and prosecution argued that wrongs have been historic and deliberate, with colonialism, racism, militarism, imperialism, materialism, criminalization, patriarchy, neocolonialism, and internal colonialism as part of the larger process that now manifests itself in medical and digital apartheid, chemical warfare, environmental violence and racism, disinvestment, and a pandemic of accessible guns and drugs, with the majority of gun violence perpetrated by police and security forces in the false claim of upholding law and order. The United States of America, represented by its president, Department of State, federal and state policing agencies, and other governmental institutions, was found guilty on all 5 counts of genocide. And the counts were police killings, mass incarceration, political prisoners, prisoners of war, environmental racism, and public health inequities. So, thoughts?
I have this resource that includes the 1951.
Yeah, that's what they were talking about. We charge genocide, right? Yeah, so this was a 2021 version in remembrance of the 1951 version.
Yes, that's pretty powerful. People like to pretend that the wrongdoings are so long ago, and I try to wrap my head around this stance that the entirety of the American right has taken, like including some assimilated members of the African nation, like Larry Elder, the kooky Trumpist who recently did a campaign here in California. He thankfully lost. Even he, despite being an older black man, takes this stance that the genocide isn't still going on. I didn't even know if he would agree with that 1951 version. It's so insane the level of genocide denialism that is present within this country. And like, I'm wondering what's the cutoff date that these types of people think exists for when Black people and all other non-whites suddenly stopped being oppressed? Was it when the civil rights laws were enacted? Was it when it's probably I would probably say it was sometime in the 60s that they think that oppression ended in America, if they even think that oppression ever existed at all. I remember a wild interview with some random white people during Martin Luther King's time who were genuinely confused about why there are these Black people in America who are protesting. They thought that Black people have it fine now, so some things never change, I guess.
Yeah. It's astounding how they'll argue, oh, that was 60 years ago. But then when you show them they're doing the exact same thing today, then they deny it. Deny. It's like there was an old movie that I watched where the guy, I think it was Jack Lemmon, he's saying to his friend got caught sleeping with another woman by the wife, you know, and he says, well, deny. He says, just get up, get dressed. She's there screaming at you. She walks out the door. Keep denying. That's what these people are like. Seriously. It's happening right before her eyes. Her husband is fucking another woman right in their bed, right before their eyes, but he denies. It's astounding. That's America for you. Next on the list, global crisis, and the growing new Hitlerian extermination campaign.
There's this anti-colonial author who I quote within this article who says that at the end of capitalism, there is Hitler. It's not a complicated idea when you think about it. It's the basic reality, as I explained, that fascism is the fighting wing of the bourgeoisie. When the bourgeoisie come under threat, they employ fascism, and out of fascism comes Hitlerian extermination campaigns. And right now we're seeing that in places like Colombia and Ukraine. In Colombia, there is a neo-Nazi governmental faction that has come to take on the advising role behind the police response to the protests from this year. And what's come out of this response that this neo-Nazi faction designed is mass disappearances, mass murders, state violence, torturings, paramilitary actions, disproportionately targeting African and indigenous protesters or just regular people who've done something to upset the settler colonial, neo-colonial state within Colombia. And it's even more alarming in Ukraine, as you described last week, where a mass grave was recently uncovered that it came to be because of a neo-Nazi regime that the US installed in Ukraine in 2014 that has been carrying out purges and torture, and they've outlawed entire facets of political organization, assembly, speech. They've gone after pretty much everybody: journalists, Jews, Roma, the LGBT community, the 1/3 of Ukraine that's Russian speaking. They're carrying out a Hitlerian extermination campaign, and the US imperialism has very deliberately engineered that.
Yeah. 1.5 million people in Ukraine have fled to Russia as refugees. and Russia has taken this 1.5 million people and put them in school, put them to work, give them places to live, and that's an extreme at an extreme cost for even as large a country as Russia to deal with that kind of refugee crisis over the period of just a few years. The people in the Donbass, that 1/3 or so of Ukraine that has broken away from the Nazi coup government that was installed by the U.S. They're still to this day under constant bombing, constant missiles being lobbed into their neighborhood. And these bombing campaigns, they're not on strategic positions, they're on residential neighborhoods. So it's quite horrendous. And Ukraine's far from the only place where we see this kind of Hitlerian extermination campaign going on. So yeah, good job there. Next on the list, the United States is organizing a color revolution in Cuba for November 15th. And this comes from Alan McLoed, MintPressNews, November 1st, 2021. The United States government is playing a key role in organizing, promoting, and amplifying upcoming nationwide protests in Cuba planned for November 15th. When directly challenged at a press conference as to whether the United States is directly involved in the planning of the overthrow of the Cuban government, State Department spokesperson Ned Price refused to deny it, instead twice giving long statements about how much the U.S. supports the protest demands, responses that skeptical readers might consider tantamount to a yes. The United States remains deeply committed to the Cuban people's struggle to freely choose their leadership and their future, Price added later in the press conference. A week later, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Juan Gonzalez, went even further, announcing that the U.S. government would sanction Cuba if it attempted to interfere with the protests. We are totally committed to supporting, maintaining, and strengthening the voice of the Cuban people who want a change, he added. At first glance, the Biden administration's position on Cuba seems to be a 180-degree change from that of Barack Obama, who moved towards normalizing relations with the Caribbean islands. However, Obama was essentially forced into doing so by united opposition across Latin America, which threatened to expel the U.S. from regional bodies if it did not pursue that course. 10 years later, many of those independent-minded governments have been overthrown, often with Washington's help. It is in this context that Biden's continuation of the Trump-era sanctions makes more sense. The sanctions have continually been declared illegal by the United Nations, which in 2014 estimated that they had caused an estimated 1.1 trillion worth of damage. 1.1 trillion to a nation of 10 million people. That's a lot of money. It remains an open question as to how successful the upcoming action against the Cuban government will be. But who is behind the protest is hardly in any doubt.
Yeah, it's the equivalent situation to imperialism's assault on the Soviet Union, where, as you said, the CIA constantly recruited people within the country to engage in subversion. Within Cuba, the CIA has been recruiting desperate people who are desperate because of US sanctions and the terrible economic conditions, to engage in acts of terrorism against their own people. So this is a cruel irony how the US is able to instigate at least some of the population within that country into waging war against their own people and doing things that do not and will never improve their own conditions, because of the very conditions that the US has imposed upon them. If the US got its so-called liberation of Cuba, all that would happen is all of these resources that the Cuban people enjoy, the few resources that the Cuban people enjoy despite the economic sanctions, would be sold off to corporations, and the people there would be left to suffer and die and become refugees in a world that's spiraling out of control amid global warming.
Yeah. Next on the list, and final, all communists must properly grasp geopolitics in order to win. Rainer Shea.
What's happened when self-identified communists have not come to properly grasp geopolitics? What's happened is they've ended up like the Philippine communists, or the Philippine Maoists, I should be more specific. I'm sure there are plenty of communists within the Philippines who are not Maoists and who would agree with me on this. The Maoists within the Philippines have been engaged in, they've been running in circles of guerrilla warfare for decades. They've not been able to win over the masses. They've deprived the country of peace due to this so-called People's War. There's a different approach, and they're not taking it because of their dogmatism that stems from their misunderstanding of geopolitics. Maoism emerged because there was this faction within the global communist movement that believed so strongly that the Soviet Union had become a social imperialist power, and therefore when China started to pursue its market reforms, they claimed that China became a social imperialist power too. So now they're going off with this narrative about how China is just another capitalist empire, and this has been behind the rationalization of the Philippine Maoists' terrorist attacks against Chinese firms. These terrorist attacks of theirs go against the national interests of the Philippines, because the Philippines needs to carry out what they're calling a new golden age of infrastructure, and they can only do this with China's help. These attacks upon Chinese firms are counterproductive. They are hurting directly the interests of the mass within the Philippines. And we're going to run into the same kinds of unnecessary hurdles and pitfalls if we also take this stance that China is imperialist.
Yeah, it's incredible that they can even say something like that. China's the number one, the most significant anti-imperialist force in the world today, and yet they're treating them this way. And I felt the same way when the Communist Party of China started their haranguing of the Soviet Union, calling the Soviet Union a social imperialist and not a socialist state and all that. It was the same, as we said up top at the beginning of the show. The people in the Soviet Union lived far better lives, far more productive, far happier, much better educated lives than the people in the United States, for instance. And to call them anything other than a socialist worker state is just ridiculous. Same thing goes now for China. So that's it for us tonight. It's been real. Made some good points there, Rainer. I think we've had some good discussion here and some good talking points, some good news worthy of talking about, some happenings worthy of talking about. Anyway, want to thank you, Rainer, for everything you've done for the show tonight. Want to thank all of our listeners and viewers who tuned in tonight, and ask you to come back again next week when we'll have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. So until then, I'll bid you a sweet adieu.